Hello and a very warm welcome along to our final What the Israeli Papers show of 2020. This is Paul Alster with you once again. We're at the end of a tumultuous year, and over the last 3 or 4 months we've been endeavouring to bring you as balanced a view as possible of what is going on in Israel and in the Israeli news. And I'm delighted to say that for this end of the year show we've got four of our favourite contributors all together at once to give us their views on what it was like being in Israel in 2020 and what might be in store for us in 2021. And to introduce our guests, and of course ladies first, Judith Sudilovsky, who for more than 25 years has been a freelance journalist covering both Israel and the Palestinian territories. And she's a regular contributor to the Catholic News Service and the Plus 972 magazine, amongst others. Judith, great to have you with us for this show.
Thank you, Paul.
And Benjamin Weinthal, a familiar face to many these days now. He is based in both Jerusalem and Berlin. He's the European correspondent of the Jerusalem Post and a fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, which is based in Washington. He's also a regular contributor to a number of major German media outlets. Benjamin, as always, really good to see you.
Thanks for having me, Paul.
Thank you. Peter Lerner is with us. He's the Director General of the International Relations Division at the Histadrut, General Federation of Labour in Israel. He's a retired Lieutenant Colonel from the IDF and for many years was a leading spokesman for the Israeli military. Peter, good to see you as well.
It's a pleasure to be here, Paul. Thank you.
And finally, representing the native-born Israelis, we have Rami Lador, who joins us from Zichron Yaakov, who he's a former executive vice president of the Southeast Asia division of Bank Hapoalim, one of Israel's very biggest banks, and he also represented that bank for a number of years in the United States. He's retired now, but has become very active in the campaign against corruption in public life and is a regular demonstrator against the current Israeli government. Rami, thanks for joining us.
Good to be here, Paul. Thank you.
Well, it's lovely for the four of you to join us. And of course, 2020 has been an extraordinary year. It's been like no other, I'm sure, any of us have had to live through. And we're going to just look at one or two of the main issues that have come to your mind as we look back at what has been very challenging. But I just want to throw something out there for you to discuss, because I noted an interesting piece in the Jerusalem Post in the last week, which was written by a columnist who contributes to Israel Hayom in particular, which is Ruth Blum. And she wrote her summary of the year, and she concluded it with the following lines. And I'd like you to give me your view on Ruth's view. She says, it is understandable for Israelis to be worried about the future and bemoan the past year, but it's a complete distortion of reality to look upon 2020 as a period of pure chaos on the one hand and paralysis on the other. She concludes, indeed, it's worth pausing from the hysteria for a moment to acknowledge the miraculous achievements made by the Netanyahu-led government in spite of months of bitter infighting during the pandemic. If anything, then, this crazy year was characterized by an insane degree of uncanny multitasking. Those aren't my words. Those are the words of Ruth Blum, who writes for Israel Hayom, and this was published in the Jerusalem Post. Maybe in 2021 we'll have her on here to give her views. But let's start with Peter, first of all. Peter, would you concur that there have been miraculous achievements from the Netanyahu-led government over the last 12 months?
Miracle, perhaps, that we've survived it. I think that what we have seen throughout the entire year is a very extensive reality of instability. And that, for me, has been the defining element of government, of COVID-19, this constant state of not knowing where things are going, who's actually running the show, and how it is actually being put together for us, the civilians, the citizens of the State of Israel, to get our lives back to normal. So no, I don't really agree with Ruthie, I'm afraid, on this. I think that there have been good things that the government has done, but they have left the people out to dry in my.
Okay, does anybody disagree with that? Any of the other three of you feel that Netanyahu's government has done a good job over the last 12 months?
Well,
I think that using the word miraculous is really stretching it a whole lot. I think that Netanyahu has been really busy with his own issues, with his own court cases, and I think to call his dealing with this issue as miraculous is really just way off. I agree with what Peter said. There's been a lot of a feeling of instability, of not knowing what's going on, of flip-flopping back and forth, and I don't think there's a sense of hysteria either. I think there's just a lot of feeling of not knowing what's happening. On the other hand, this is what's going on in the whole world. We're dealing with something that hasn't happened in decades, so everybody's kind of like juggling around trying to figure out how to use it. But miraculous, no.
No. Well, we've got a cross-section of views here from our panel who are kind of positioned to the left, to the centre and to the right. I suppose, Benjamin, you're probably more to the right than any of the other three. Do you feel that Netanyahu has conducted himself and the government response to the challenges this year in a miraculous fashion, as Ruth Blum suggests?
Well, I think Judith makes a good point that Israel's dealing with a situation that's unprecedented, like every other country in the world right now, and countries all across the world are going through multiple lockdowns. Israel's been plunged into its third lockdown. Yes, there are imperfections in terms of the COVID case, but on the other hand, if you look at the Netanyahu administration's foreign policy, I think one could say it's been a miraculous year for his government in terms of for normalization agreements with Arab countries, Sudan, Morocco, Bahrain, the UAE. That is miraculous. It hasn't happened in decades. And Israel's avoided a war this year. There's, of course, many military strikes in Syria targeting terrorist entities such as Hezbollah and Iranian-controlled assets, but it has not led to any type of widespread conflict. And I would add that the recent vaccination program, at least this nascent phase of it, is miraculous, although that was Ruthie probably wrote her column prior to the vaccination program or the results of it, I should say. But there's been a massive industrial-wide mobilization of Israeli society that right now, as I understand, is leading the world in terms of the vaccination rate, with over, I believe, 500,000 Israelis who have been vaccinated. So I guess in that sense, one could apply miraculous to Israel's government with a small m, I would add.
Okay, Rami, miraculous with a small m. Would you agree with that?
I see that Netanyahu is really doing a good job in promoting himself, his leadership, without any truism to the statements he makes. I'll take two examples. The vaccinations and the fact that Israel is getting something like, will get something like its entire population vaccinated by the summer. And that is not because of Netanyahu, it's despite of Netanyahu. The Pfizer and Moderna and other drug companies, they have an interest to have a nationwide experiment in a place that's contained, that you can actually have some sort of an effect on the results without it being just a widespread experiment. And here, Israel is a closed country, only one entrance and exit point in Ben Gurion Airport. And another thing is, Israel has the Kupat Cholim, the medical structure to accommodate the experiment in the way that the Pfizer and Moderna will dictate. That is, they can do, and they're proving that they're doing a tremendous setup. The organization of the vaccination is done where there's no second medical organization in the world, or hospital, that can organize it in such a fashion. And it was just in the interest of the medical companies, the Pfizer and Moderna, to have the first massive deals with Israel. As far as the peace with the Emirates and maybe New Zealand and other countries which we never had war with, I really don't give any credit to Netanyahu, except the fact that he didn't harm anything by his blabbering, for example, his meeting in Saudi Arabia. To me, everything he does is only for PR. He has no regard for what is good for the country, and he has all the regard for what might affect his court cases.
Okay, well, that's certainly a robust view from Rami. We expect no less. We're going to come on to the different aspects that have featured this year. But of course, Corona is one of the, if not the big story. There's really been nothing else this year. And I'm interested to know how you all managed to get through the Corona, and how you have felt that the sort of roller coaster ride through the first, second, and now this third supposed closure that we have now has been dealt with. I'll just give you a very personal example of my own, because when things started to become apparent that there was a pandemic on the way, I was actually in Seoul in South Korea broadcasting on international sport. And I had to be tested 6 times a day going in and out of the arena. Everybody was with face masks, and everybody was saying, well, these Koreans, they're absolutely ridiculous. It's all, exaggerated. And then on the way home, when I got on the plane at Seoul to fly to Moscow, we were told there was no restrictions on landing in Israel. When I got to Moscow, I was told there was a complete closure, and then I would have to go into 2 weeks isolation. So I spent the flight from Moscow to Tel Aviv, as well as jet lagged, very, very concerned about being in 2 weeks isolation, although I was promised there would be a 2-week supply of dark chocolate and a telephone list of reliable takeaways in the area. But when we landed at Ben Gurion, they changed the rules again. And I was told there was no need for any isolation, and I could go home to the bosom of my family, so to speak. So it was confusion reigned, and nobody was being checked, including all the Korean pilgrims who were on the plane with me, who, as it turned out, were one of the main carriers into Israel of the coronavirus. So it was a bit of a salat, as they say in Israel, a bit of a mixture. I'm wondering how you guys felt the situation was dealt with from stage 1, the first closure, to the second in the summer, and now this third. Who wants to have a view on that one? All quiet on the Western Front. Peter.
Yeah, sure. So from the outset, it was clear to me that the entire plan of action of the government was to push off critical decisions in order to gain time until there is a vaccine. I think everything that we saw and that we've experienced throughout these 10 months now reflects that reality. From the outset, it was clear to me that was the decision that the government was going to, and so I basically buckled down. I had to change all of my plans. I was supposed to be all over the place this year, from Canada to the Far East, and obviously all of those things changed, and we all went into virtual mode. So I think we've learned a lot from 2020 in that respect, of the ability to travel less, engage more online, but also we're also lacking the people-to-people contact, the actual face-to-face. How do you do international relations without the contact, the physical contact and confidence building measures that you do when you have face-to-face, enjoy a beer together, have dinner together, and talk other than business? So I think if going through the entire process of these last 10 months until we've started the vaccination of the country, definitely for me was, as I said, from the outset, it was clear that was going to be the agenda. every process that we've gone through, the last minute decisions that the government has made night before, the day before, the moments before, from going back to school, from closing down schools, everything was how do we gain time without spending too much money on behalf of the government until there is a vaccination for the people. Thank God it's actually on the table now.
And Peter, just to follow up on that, really, with regard to your position with the Histadrut, which of course is a body that represents the workers in Israel and their rights, do you feel the government has stepped up to the plate enough in supporting workers, both those that are employed and self-employed?
So I would say the government policies were insufficient from the outset. The policies put in place were also part of this idea of how do we gain time without creating a true, real safety net for the people. So furlough programs were insufficient. The processes for self-employed or for small businesses or for loans or government loans, they were all tied up in the unbelievable red tape that we have here in this country, making it difficult, not easy for people to get the self-assurances, to get the confidence that they can stay at home, stay healthy, and not be concerned of the financial burdens that come with staying at home and not going to work. So unfortunately, the Histadrut has been a major player throughout this trying time. And keeping in mind that there is a limit and a realm of what we can actually do, because what do? We take the whole economy to strikes in a time where there's no business anyway. So the utilization of negotiations and sitting around the table, not turning the table upside down, was the strategy that the Histadrut has taken in order to try and cushion some of those difficulties. We established this year a forum for the self-employed, and together with the Likud party actually laid on the table of the parliament a law that will create for the next crisis of this magnitude a compensation package that will automatically go into place. So self-employed in the future will have that safety net. But I think it's been a trying year from a worker's point of view. We need to keep in mind all of the decisions at the end of the day need to put the person at the center of the decision making.
Yeah, anybody else with a view on this one? Do you feel that the government has supported the average man in the street enough? Have you personally had any experience of being supported or given any light at the end of the tunnel? I know as a self-employed person, I feel that the support for people that are not employed was woeful. I actually do feel that compared to other countries, I think we were way, way behind. And I think a lot of people have been left to basically sink or swim. And I'm sorry to say that a lot of people, especially with small businesses and individual traders, are, starved of oxygen, and they're really almost on life support. Any views on that?
Well, I think also in addition, you're completely correct in pointing out the small business owners who have really been left to sink. I think also the issue of the tourism industry has been really hard hit, and not only here but also for Palestinians. I mean, Bethlehem's whole economy is based on tourism, and in one day it was completely shut down. So their economy has been really hard hit, and as our neighbors, we really need to be concerned about what's happening there, because that can affect us. As we know, when there's more poverty and less, people don't have the comforts that they need, things can get more radical because they have nowhere to turn, and other people can infiltrate into those areas, and we need to be aware of that too, I think. But a lot of tour guides, a lot of hotels, restaurants, all that have depended on tourism, they're really suffering as well.
Yes.
And I just wanted to also, on a little bit of a personal note, as a mother with, I see my son has spent, almost 10 months learning on Zoom, and you become concerned about how that affects. He's older. He's already in 9th grade, so he's not one of the younger ones. But how that interpersonal connection with friends, how that will affect in the future. most of the contact is with his friends is through computers. So how is that going to affect the future? How is that, especially for younger children, I would say, how does that affect their social skills if this continues?
Yeah, I think it's obviously very difficult for the younger generation. Also, though, for the older generation who have been locked away and have been struggling to see people, I suppose Rami is the senior figure on the panel here and a grandfather. It's a difficult time, isn't it, when you have to keep yourself hidden away? And Israelis, I think, to a great extent, in the mainstream, they have been sticking to the rules and trying to distance as much as possible for fear of infecting older and maybe more vulnerable relatives.
It's amazing that the senior population, those on retirement who have fixed income, didn't get hurt. The people got hurt are mainly the people who their salary is not a consistent one. It depends on their sales volume, restaurants, tourist industry, and depends on customers. And it's a problem. And I think all in all, we Israelis are handling this crisis, which is a long crisis. Nobody believed it would be more than a year, and it is more than a year, with amazing patience. However, I think it would help a lot if we get clear signals or rational decisions from the decision makers. Every single decision almost to close, not to close, schools are open, some grades are closed, some grades are reopened in half an hour. Eilat, open as a tourist green island, closed as a tourist green island less than 2 weeks after that. And no rationale. You can't play tennis, but you can walk in the fields without a mask. And all these things, if there was some rationale, if the spokesman for the Ministry of Health would have been a bit more careful about the number of press conferences they have, and whatever they do provide would be more rationale, I think it would have helped a lot of us cope with the unknown.
Yeah, and Benjamin, just a question to you here, because it's something you brought up on one of the early programs, actually, which is the personal example that has been set by leading figures in Israel. We've seen, particularly in the early days when it was around Passover, the Pesach time, that they were informing everybody you had very strictly to stick to the rules and regulations. But as we know, the Prime Minister, the President, the Health Minister, and others, they all broke the rules themselves. The examples being set, and I don't think Israel was alone in this, it happened in other countries as well, they weren't the best, were they?
No, as I mentioned, I believe a few months ago, thanks for reminding me, reviving my short-term memory. Top down, the leadership of each country has to set an example, and those transgressions by Israelis leaders certainly did not send a good message to ordinary citizens, and I think might have created a more lax environment. It's hard to say in terms of social distancing and wearing masks. Certainly there are parts of the population, based on media reports, and I've spoken to some physicians, these parts of the population, some of the ultra-Orthodox community, part of the Israeli Arab community are more reticent about embracing some of these measures. I don't know what role the leadership of Israel played in that, in terms of not adhering to the measures, but it happened also at a sort of critical stage too, during the infection process. So I'm sure there'll be dissertations and studies and talk shows analyzing this process in the future to see what role that played, but as I mentioned, it certainly was not helpful.
Yeah, and I just want to ask you, before we move on to a sort of more a broader picture about the region, I'd like to ask each one of you in turn, what was the most annoying or the most lowest point that you felt over the last year? What was the one thing that really almost made you tear your hair out We'll go to the chap with the least hair on the panel. That's Rami Lador. What was the one thing that really got your goat, as they say?
May 13th, 2020, May 13th, 2020 is when the High Court of Justice, after it's been facing 8 petitions to deny a Knesset member who's been indicted for 3 corruption cases, including bribery, fraud, and breach of trust, the High Court of Justice decided that it's okay for him to run and be elected as prime minister. At that time, to remind you, Benjamin Netanyahu was ending his term as prime minister in the interim government, at which point he was a regular Knesset member. And then, as a Knesset member, can you be elected to be prime minister with the indictments? There is a rule in Israel, a practice in Israel called the Deri-Pinchasi practice, which makes the prime minister fire any minister that's indicted for a criminal offense. And here we have a situation that's totally crazy. You cannot be a minister in the government that you're going to create. Why was I so disappointed? Because 11 judges unanimously did not have the courage to make the ethical decision. Now, 2 points about it. Why did we have 11 judges sitting on that panel? Because obviously the president of the Justice Chayut thought it was a big enough case, important enough case, a serious enough case that we need to have a large panel of 11 justices sitting and deciding whether he can go and be elected as prime minister. However, those 11 decided unanimously. If it is so clear-cut, there's no way on earth that she would have chosen 11 people. If it was 5 to 6 or 4 to 7, right, that becomes 11, I would say, okay, you have to lose. You go in front of a court, whatever the judges decide, but the unanimous decision proves to me that either the justices were scared to face the Netanyahu popularity, or they just kind of lost any sense of integrity, because I ask a simple question in every conversation. Is it okay for Israel to have a prime minister that indicted for fraud, for bribery, and breach of trust, whereas the prime minister cannot be his own driver, because a driver in a government office cannot be accepted to the job if he's charged with the same allegations? So that to me was the worst day, May 13th, the unanimous decision of the court.
Well, a very specific date that you've thrown into the mix there. Let's go to Peter. What was the point this year that you felt was the low point for you personally in Israel?
So I actually relate a lot to what Rami was talking about. In my view, I think a couple of weeks later, after that decision, it was the first court appearance of Netanyahu. And for me, I think that was when we look at our leaders, and throughout all of my military service, it was all about lead by example. And we have the prime minister, the leader of the state of Israel, our prime minister, being charged and coming to court. And I think that image of him standing there, looking back at the journalist sitting behind him with these eyes, I think that's an image, for me, that's the image of 2020. But it's not all bad, because on one hand, you have the prime minister being charged and of these crimes, but on the other hand, you at least have the image of the justice system is equal for all. At least we like to believe that. And I think that is perhaps the flip side of that image, where if I was being charged, I would stand in the hall the same way as the prime minister. Probably there would be less people standing and listening in, but that's basically, it goes to shame. So it goes to show the concept. So I'd say good and bad, but I think it's definitely a very symbolic image. And it's shameful that our prime minister has been charged. And I hope that he comes out clean. But if he doesn't, then he, like everybody else, should pay the price.
Well, of course, the Israeli public will get their chance to pass judgment on him again in March when we have another round of elections, our fourth in 2 years. Benjamin, just to come to you here, was there a point in 2020 that stood out for you as a particular low before we get to hopefully a high just a little bit later on?
Well, I think the point you just mentioned, the new election, that is the dissolution of the Knesset this month, and the fourth election that will take place within 2 years, that's set for March. I'm always a fan of, the only cure for democracy is more democracy, to cite that well-worn platitude. But I think there comes a point where this what Gerald Steinberg, a Israeli professor, calls a hyper-democracy, perhaps reaches a point where, especially during the pandemic, where you have to try to maintain a stable government. I think Benny Gantz, the alternate prime minister, I think now has internalized the fact, or perhaps did at the point when he joined the government, that Prime Minister Netanyahu had out-negotiated him, and now we're Israel set for a fourth election that I strongly suspect could have been prevented and is largely superfluous and really doesn't will only create more expenditures for the government at the cost of the Israeli population. But there seems to, from my perspective, there had to have been a better alternative.
Yes, a case maybe of democracy gone mad with four elections in the space of 2 years, no budgets passed, so a lot of important government ministries and organizations struggling for funding. Judith, what about your thoughts on 2020? When was the moment that you thought, I just can't believe what's going on here?
Well, I just want to point out that I want to differ with bit of semantics with Benjamin. I would say that Gantz has realized not that only that Netanyahu has out-negotiated, but more like out-manipulated. I think Gantz got into a soup that he just was not prepared to deal with all the snakes that were in that pit. Well, I said soup, so I kind of mixed the images, but I think that Gantz just got into a snake pit and did not know how to manage. And so I don't think it has anything to do with negotiations, but a lot of manipulations and politics. So again, another election and fourth election in 2 years is very disappointing. But I wanted to point out not just one specific moment, but a continuing issue that Israel is facing, and that, of course, with the pandemic and elections and everything gets pushed to the wayside. But there's the continuing violence in Arab communities here. Just a few days ago, there was horrendous, almost gangland type shootings in Lud between two families who've been feuding for almost 2 years, and it's something that needs to be addressed, because it's not an issue of the community being more violent. It's an issue of a long history of the history of the Arab community in Israel. People have to look back and understand where this is coming from, and not just say where they're a violent community, because that's not true. That's not the issue. The issue is how they've been treated over the years, how the police have neglected criminal activity, and maybe even in some way, by their neglect, have supported this happening, as long as it's not in Jewish communities. The allowing for proliferation of weapons in Arab communities, the lack of housing, of not being able to have housing permits. So there's a lot. I just want to read a few statistics. I wrote them down because I can't remember numbers.
Go on then, go for it, Judith. Let's hear them.
Okay, let me see. I got them here. Let's see. The number of homicides have increased 1.5% in the Arab communities between 2011 and 2019. But
1.5% or what?
1.5% between 2011 and 2019. Between 2014 and 2017, less than a third of the murders have been solved in Arab communities. 95 Arabs have been killed in Israel this year. I'm not sure if that includes the 3 that were killed just recently.
It doesn't.
Okay. So we're almost reaching 100. And that's gone up from 89 in 2019 and up from 71 in 2018. So I think that these are some issues that really need to be addressed, because they're part of Israeli society, and they can't just be, thrown to the wolves and just ignored because it's them. It's us too. And a lot of it has to do with the police and government, the way they treat the community. And so that whole continuing issue this year has been very troubling to me.
And do we feel that going into this next round of elections in March, folks, that we're going to see any real changes to the lay of the land here in Israel? Now, for people that don't follow the situation very closely, we've seen the leader of the Labour Party announce his resignation, Amir Peretz, stepping down. Labour Party that's falling apart at the seams very, very quickly, a force that was once the major power here in Israel for many years. We've seen Gideon Sa'ar emerging as potentially a serious challenger to Netanyahu for the votes of people that traditionally vote for the Likud. Ofer Shelach, who used to be part of Yesh Atid, has said he's going to form a new centrist party, and he's going to shake things up. And then only yesterday, Ron Huldai, the mayor of Tel Aviv for the last 22 years, credited in great part with the flourishing of Tel Aviv, he's announced that at the age of 78, he's going to run to create a new left-wing party. So it means that when we go to the ballot box in 8 or 10 weeks' time, or however many weeks it is, we're going to have a choice of parties, maybe 20, 30 parties. Is there any way we're going to have a more stable government? Is Netanyahu still going to be there? What sort of coalitions are going to be formed? Who wants to have first crack at what? Get out their crystal ball and do their Gypsy Rose Lee act and tell me what's going to happen at the next elections.
I'm willing to try to give it my try. So I would say, first of all, historically, Israeli politics have always been about mergers and fragmentation, always throughout the course of our history. So now 2020 or 2021 isn't going to be any different. And as you rightly pointed out, what we see now is a deep fragmentation of the left. And I would actually say that it's jeopardizing the ability of the left to actually even be represented in this in the next government. Will Netanyahu still be out leading? I expect that nothing that any of the other parties have can actually unseat him as such. I still believe that he will come out strong or strong enough to try and form the parties, whether it's with the ultra-Orthodox or with some of the other right-wing parties that have said that they will not sit with him. So I expect us to have in 2021, unfortunately, more of the same.
More of the same. Anybody feel that that's not likely to happen, that we could see a shake-up of the politics here? No? Judith, you think things are going to stay the same, more or less?
Unfortunately, I agree with almost everything that Peter said, and it's with great sadness that I say that. I think that the left has proven itself that it's ready to disappear, unfortunately, instead of joining forces together. I think that it's time that the left has also starts to include Arab parties as a true part of their coalition, and not be afraid of joining with them as part of a coalition and not making them a pariah. I think that unfortunately this is just going to become a more right-wing government.
I want to ask you, where's the centre gone? Rami, you were very involved at one point with Yesh Atid. You were even on their list at one point down at, I can't remember what number it was, but you were involved in them, no longer with them. Where is the centre of Israeli politics? Where's it gone?
Let me take it a bit to a sidetrack, and that is, I don't really believe that the issue of being left, right, or center matters in the next election. Exactly the same as it didn't matter in the previous election and the two before that. there's only one issue, except the corona, which is a national crisis everybody understands that we somehow need to get over. But there's one issue in this election, and that is, are you for Bibi or are you against Bibi? In Hebrew, rak Bibi or rak lo Bibi. Now, I think in this election, again, we'll see a coalition that could be formed of rak lo Bibi. We are against Bibi, never Bibi again. But they cannot unite in order to get over the numbers of the Likud and the Haredim parties. So unfortunately, the majority, just like in the last elections, will vote to oust Bibi from office, yet he will be in office because after the election, they will not be able to unite. I want to make just a side interesting observation that I read in the news, and that is that if there's a fifth election, guess what? We have an interim government. And if there's an interim government, comes November, if we last till then, and in November, Bibi's no longer prime minister, Benny Gantz is a prime minister if there's another election, even if he's not a Knesset member, because that's a Chok Yesod, a basic law that was created when the unity government was created. So it's a big mess, the politics here, and we might have a prime minister that's not a member of the Knesset if we have a fifth election. Quite entertaining.
Well, that's an interesting point. That I wasn't aware of that, but that would be extraordinary, really, if that was allowed to happen. Benjamin, from your point of view, I just wanted to ask you, Gideon Sa'ar, one of the platforms that he's running on is that no prime minister should be able to serve more than 8 years. Do you think that's a reasonable suggestion, given the experience in the United States and some other countries where a politician can maybe only give of their best for a certain period of time, and trying to hang on like so many do can be counterproductive?
Well, it's interesting. I just had this discussion about term limits with a German filmmaker, documentary filmmaker, who lives in Munich the other day. And because Merkel, I believe, will end her term, the Chancellor of Germany, after 15 years in office. And Bibi has now been in office for over 10 years. And we were both of the same opinion that the American system of 8 years, you're term limited after 8 years as president, makes more sense. And I do think that's, I'm originally from New York State, and I do think term limits do help because they allow, so to speak, new blood to enter the political bloodstream. It breathes new fire and life into the political process, and you're not wedded to one figure, as Rami said, where the election, and I think that's a really good point, revolves around, are you either for Bibi or against Bibi? And that is a central part of this coming election, I do think. So term limits, I think, would certainly would help the Israeli political system. Not whether there's the political will to bring that about in terms of the inner workings of the Knesset, and whether something like that could pass. I suppose it could, given that there is a lot of dissatisfaction on the center right with Bibi, given Sa'ar had broke away from Likud. But I do want to make one point about this election. Even though Bibi is sort of the be-all and end-all of Israeli politics right now, the left, I think, has a problem because it does not mirror the political interests of a large part of the Israeli public. Security interests. So the left has largely drifted off into political oblivion, and we now have mainly right and center right and sort of centrist parties that reflect the Israeli public, and that's the reality. That's what outside of Israel folks don't understand, that leftists have generally exported their ideology to Europe and the United States to try to undermine Israeli democracy, but they have no base in Israel. They have no constituency. It's largely the right, as I said.
I just want to. Could you just repeat that? The undermine is that the left has been imported to undermine Israeli democracy. Could you please clarify what you mean by that? Because I'm a little bit.
When you spend a considerable part of time in Europe, as I have, I lived in Germany for 15 years. Most of the Israelis who live in Germany, and there's a sizable community there, are left or radical leftists who promote BDS, the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions movement. I mean, we're talking about a small number, a couple, but they garner a disproportionate amount of media attention, and they have no base in Israel. So they leave Israel, and they have to go to foreign countries where they can find an audience that will play into what I would call anti-Semitic views of the Jewish state and Jews, and they fan the flames of those that anti-Israeli hysteria. Now I'm talking about a very small minority, but they're also the left in general. I think simply has no base in Israel. It's either centrist or right of center right now. David Horowitz did a nice column about this in the Times of Israel after the dissolution of the Knesset, writing about the power politics of Israel right now and the political spectrum. And I think he nailed it if one has a chance to read that column.
Okay, well, I just want to express my disagreement with how you expressed it, saying that the left is trying to. Well, how did you say about undermining Israeli democracy? I think having a leftist opinion does not mean you're trying to express to fight against Israeli democracy, or that just being against and I'm not necessarily supporting BDS. I'm not saying whether I do or not, but I think that by calling some leftists, and I do think that there are some anti-Semitic feelings out there. I'm not denying it, but I think that that you can't come out and call all leftist ideas anti-Semitic. It can be just being against this particular Israeli government does not mean you're anti-Semitic. I think of course, the elections are showing that the Israeli population is quite right wing, and I'm not so sure about centrist, but and that's a sad reality that I see here, that does not maybe not only in Israel, but that the right and even extreme right has taken a lot of control of issues, and that's a very sad thing for me to see. But I really do oppose saying that leftist views undermine Israeli democracy. I think that's a dangerous point of view to be expressing, and I think that leftist views are just as democratic and just as valid as right or centrist views here, and should not be pointed out as being anti-Israeli or anti-democratic. Because I think leftists most leftists are very pro-Israel, just anti-occupation, anti this government.
Well, it certainly is a very hot topic, and I think there's a lot in what you both said, and I'm sure people watching will share some views and not others. I want to ask you one question though before we move on to just another point about what's going on here in Israel today. I want you to ask you: is there any way? Do any of you feel that, for me, you see, the biggest problem with Israeli politics is ego? That all these people believe that they can create a party that is going to break the mold, but you can't have 20 or 30 parties that are all going to break the mold. And there are so many not prepared to get together for the common good because they want the top job and not the second job down. Do you think there's going to come a point anytime soon where, let's say, the centre parties, and there are now a growing number of them, will somehow come together and stay together, not split apart as they did when Benny Gantz joined the coalition government with Benjamin Netanyahu, having stood on a platform that Raglo Bibi, anything but Bibi is what he said, and then he eventually went and jumped ship and went in with him. Peter, do you think that ego is ever going to be left aside in Israeli politics?
Unfortunately, I'm not a man of good news in this issue. I believe that the situation currently is one where you have these messiah politicians that come one after the other, and the debate today is General Gadi Eisenkopf. He announced he's not going to join, and then there was like this sigh of relief saying, "Oh, the general is not joining. He's made a wise political decision, because nobody is going to beat Bibi this time anyway. So I would say the only way to move forward from this type of politics is if we create a threshold where political parties need to have democratic processes in order to be eligible to be elected. That way they would actually be representing ideas, not just people, when they're elected. And that way we could create a reality where the parties would actually represent something and not be catchphrases like just not Bibi or just Bibi on the other hand. So we have, the Likud party with all of its issues has democratic processes, but unfortunately, except for them and Meretz, I think even the Labour Party today are having issues after Amir Peretz decided that the elections for the party leadership would be taken from the entire party just to a select number of the leaders. So we have this reality where all of the parties are people that nominate themselves, and they create a coalition of people that they think are good people to be in the team with, and then they present this list, and then they are being presented as the solution for everything that is bad. And then you put in this note in the polling station. So I think that the only way out of this is to reshuffle the political system. Unfortunately, I think very much agree with Benjamin what he said. There's very little motivation internally in the political system to create a better system for democracy in Israel. So we're suffering with the Israeli type of democracy that puts the ego type leaders that think that they have what it takes, but they don't necessarily have public support. And that, I think, at the end of the day, democracy, these people are supposed to represent us. And sometimes, if Benny Gantz, who I voted for in the last elections or in the last 3 elections, in the end of the day goes against what the majority of the people that voted for him and sits with Netanyahu because of the political reality, he does it because his connection with the voters is not strong enough and binding to make him consider the popular vote before he actually makes that decision, or not consider it enough, because the price he paid, and obviously we're seeing it in the polls this week, his political career seems to be at the very edge of where it could be in the last 3 elections.
Yes, he does appear to be struggling to go on. Benjamin, you wanted a point.
Just 2 quick points. Just to as a corollary to what Peter mentioned, I think one other, and Paul, what you mentioned about term limits, I guess one other area that's been stressed about reforming the Israeli political system is to raise the bar in terms of what would be required to enter to the Knesset. Right now, a political party needs 3.25%, I believe, of the vote to enter the Knesset. So hence, Israel has this, what you described as over, I think, 20 parties that will be competing for seats in the Knesset in March, which is, probably at the top of the political barometer in terms of electoral politics across the world. And the second point, just in response to Judith, I think there has been some semantic corruption here. Namely, I'm not using a catch-all phrase in terms of criticizing leftist voters or leftists as undermining democracy. I do think there is a segment of the population, and as I mentioned, some Israelis who live abroad, especially in Europe, that I've experienced, who promote, and I think BDS is a deeply anti-Semitic movement. I mean, even the German parliament and the Austrian parliament and the U.S. government have classified this boycott movement targeting Israel as anti-Semitic, which seeks, when you just look at the plain language of the movement from 2005, and I've been dealing with BDS, also in the labor movement, I should mention for Peter, I worked with the German trade union movement and the American trade union movement back in 2006 to secure a joint statement against BDS when I was working as a labor reporter and doing some I guess, pro-Israel work on the side. But I should note that this movement has nothing to do with peace, and it has everything to do with dismantling the Israeli state. And I think it's a fair characterization to say that those Israelis who are mainstreaming BDS or actually supporting it are anti-democratic and fanning the flames of Jew hatred.
Well, I think you've made your point there, Benjamin. I want to just try and move us on because we've got about 10 minutes left, and I want to very quickly look at what's been going on in the region over the last year, because there have been some very significant developments. Of course, we have the normalization treaties with a number of countries in the region and beyond, which I think all of us are happy to see. Whether they make a huge impact on everyday life here is something you can comment on. But also, I'd like to hear what you think as far as the status quo as regards Israel and its potential enemies in the region, with the taking out of the head of the Iranian nuclear program attributed to Israeli action, as well as other incidents that have seen weapons transfers in the north in particular being intercepted by allegedly Israeli strikes. So do we feel that we're in a safer region now than we did at the start of 2020? Who wants to have first crack at this one? Rami.
Let me try. I want to answer first because I don't know. I really don't know. And it bothers me that I don't know, because it has to do with the very thing that we're talked to and taught and learned to be aware of ever since we're children in this country, the security and Israel being alone and the region and everything so catastrophic. Add to that the Hamas and the Hezbollah in Iran. And I don't know how to fight Iran. You know, I can barely talk English in a Zoom meeting like this. I don't know how to fight Iran. But I do know that I want to trust that the people who should know are acting in the best interest of myself, my children, and my grandchildren, and the panel that you assembled here. And that part I do not have. I do not have that confidence that the people that are in charge are doing the best. I'll give you two examples. You see a lot in the networks, in the Facebook, etc. People asking, Benny Gantz was our chief of staff. He knows how to make this. This is the way we make decisions. But that's the weaker of the 2 points I want to make. Again, Benjamin Netanyahu, the elections issue. How can I trust him? How can I trust him when he let Germany approved Germany selling sophisticated submarines to Egypt without the knowledge of the chief of staff, the head of the Mossad, the head of the Minister of Security, Bogi Ayalon? When they themselves don't trust, how am I, as a citizen, supposed to trust a security system? Going back to the Emirates, okay? I don't know. I hear that they all of a sudden get 30 or so, how do you call those airplanes? 35 F-35s.
Mm-hmm. The plane, the jets, fighter jets, yeah.
I don't know. I don't feel comfortable about it. I know that when Israel approved it, which initially Benjamin Netanyahu denied that he approved it to the Americans, when Israel approved it, it wasn't disclosed. Okay, what are we hiding? My point is, the region seems to be okay. IDF seems to be a very strong military, and our intelligence, the Mossad, the Shabak, the Secret Service, they all seem to be okay. However, I want to have the confidence that the leaders are doing the best to protect me. Right now, in the elections that we talked about, in this environment, I do not have that confidence. And it's sad because I think close to, if not over 50% of the people in this country feel the same.
Okay, Peter, I can see you're itching to say a few words about that.
So, when throughout the course of the history of the State of Israel, when all else failed, we knew we could count on the IDF to safeguard the country. So I think the assassination at the end of November of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh definitely makes the region safer in the mid to short term. In the long term, we don't know, but definitely it makes the region safer. The fact that the chief nuclear scientist is no longer the chief nuclear scientist makes this region better. It doesn't mean that the Iranians will stop their program. It doesn't mean that they will necessarily that it will deter them in the long run. But definitely, this is just the tip of the iceberg that gets exposed. The Chief of Staff, the IDF Chief of Staff, Major General, Lieutenant General Aviv Kochavi, recently said that over the last year, or since the beginning of the year, over 500 activities have taken place throughout the region by the IDF, most of those covert and go mostly unnoticed. Those are all the entire concept of the military activities that they call the campaign between the campaigns is to deter war and prolong the peaceful times between wars that Israel unfortunately has with some of its neighbors, Hezbollah, Hamas, Palestinian terrorists that conduct different types of attacks. So I definitely say the amount of strikes or attacks and operations that have been conducted definitely mean that we're in a safer time. But it also means that on the receiving end of those 500 operations, there was hostile activities planned against Israel to a certain, at different levels, whether it's supplying sophisticated munitions or setting up shop on the borders on Syria, all different types of activities, or in the Sinai Desert, or different types of things that mostly go unnoticed. And I think that's for the better. And I think on a final note with regard to Israel's security this year, coronavirus has had a huge impact on Israel's security. In the last year, we've had, I think, just over 200 rockets fired from Gaza towards Israel. And that's 2020. The year before, in 2019, we had over 1,000. So there's another effect of COVID that is influencing the situation. People are staying at home. There's less incentive to go out and conduct strikes. So maybe this will have a prolonged result where people are more involved and interested in dealing with their internal problems. So are we better off? I would definitely say in the short midterm, yes. Are the strategic questions that Rami raised here being answered? No, this is what we require: political leadership that has the vision to set in the institutions. We talked earlier about the unbelievable success of Israel's vaccination program that has been taking place just this week. The vision of laying National Health Service, the Kupot Cholim, the health providers throughout the country. That vision, if that vision by the founders of the State of Israel wasn't laid 70, 80, 90 years ago, then where would we be today? So we need leaders that have the vision of safeguarding society, safeguarding security, and have the vision to place now and plant now the infrastructure that we will need for 100 years time forward. Unfortunately, we don't have that.
Judith, just a few thoughts from you on this. Are we safer than we were last year?
Well, I basically think Rami said most of what I believe. Also, he expressed how I feel. But I want to point out that while we're all looking regionally, I think we need to look more locally too, in that we need to address our problems and our issues with the Palestinians, because until that happens, there'll never be true security. There'll never be true. We'll never be able to relax, because these are our neighbors. These are the people that we interact with every single day. They're on our borders. They are come to our hospitals, and rightly so. They're the people that we need to live with. So while it's nice that, we can, Israelis go traveling to Bahrain, I don't think it's such a great idea right now, but, they've gone off to Bahrain. Now everybody's excited about going to Morocco. But we have to look right outside our window and see how we can finally solve that issue. I'm not going to start, arguing about how and who and what, but that's an issue that's been ignored. And that's when there will be real peace and security for us, when our neighbors, maybe we don't have to become best friends, but we can live next to each other and with equality and safety for everybody.
Well, let's hope that particular area develops. Who knows? Maybe the change in the American administration might have some effect in bringing the Palestinians around, although to a great extent the Trump administration did make some big waves here in this particular
Not
country.
necessarily positive waves, though, didn't
Well,
it? Maybe,
that's why I didn't
for
specify what
okay.
what sort of waves they were, but certainly there are some aspects that I think a lot of people in this country were very, very happy with. Others maybe less so. Benjamin, just a final word on this, because of course this is your beat, really, the region, Iran and such. Do you think that Iran is less of a threat now to us than it was at the start of 2020?
Well, I think, I guess to mirror what Peter said, in the short term, yes, because Iran's nuclear facility, Natanz, as we know, was its production was set back with a form of sabotage over the summer. That will probably delay Iran's nuclear weapons program. Then, of course, the assassination of one of its top nuclear weapons scientists, who's also a designated terrorist. People abroad seem to forget that. And then the COVID period also tragically has also hurt the Iranian population and its leadership, from Supreme Leader Khamenei to its president Hassan Rouhani to its foreign minister Mohammad Zarif, have mismanaged incredibly mismanaged the COVID crisis in Iran, which has been hit hardest in the region, and played games with the numbers. I think the long-term solution here has to be a joint front with Sunni countries that Israel is allied with, and the United States, and hopefully European governments, to help bring about democracy promotion in Iran. I know regime change is now a politically and socially incorrect phrase, but there has to be an effort similar to what took place during the Soviet communist period, where the West will work with the Iranian population that holds its leadership in contempt, and will bring about a democratic Iran. I think that's entirely possible. And that will, in my view, and I'm somewhat sanguine about this, will help end Iran being a state sponsor of terrorism, according to both the Obama and Trump administrations, and end Iran's jingoism in the region. So the other problem, putting aside Iran, but Iran is also connected to the second problem, is Hezbollah, the de facto regime that controls the terrorist entity that controls the Lebanese government in a de facto way, and also oversees 150,000 missiles that are aimed at Israel. These precision-guided munitions are going to be, in my view, and this has been written about in the Israeli press, so it's no great insight at all, as the chief danger for Israel coming up, I think, in the next year, once we're beyond the pandemic crisis, and also Iranian assets in southern Syria remain a very big problem. So the key, from my perspective, is to end on this note: is the Netanyahu government, or whatever successor government comes into place in Israel, needs to work closely with the United States and its allies in the region to blunt Iran and Hezbollah. And there has to be a unified vision, to use the word that was mentioned here, and to deal with this highly dangerous country in a regime in Tehran, excuse me.
Well, going into 2021, which is only just around the corner now, we have that challenge to face amongst many others. We're going to wrap it up here, but I just want to come to each one of you in turn briefly, and I want you to cast your minds ahead, and let's say, for argument's sake, that by the end of April, early May, the pandemic has been brought under control, and most of us have had our double dose of vaccination, and the world starts to open up again. What is the first thing you're going to do? What's the one thing you've missed out on, having been pinned down for so long, that you're going to rush to do when the world gets back to some sort of normality? I'll come to you first, Rami. What will you be doing first?
I know I'll continue the practice of making my own food, not so much in restaurants. I rediscovered my ability to make sandwiches from my college days, and they're the best. Other than that, I really hope that the demonstrations will stop, not because of the pandemic, because we'll have a better government, and we'll just return to normality, i.e. 2 or 3 times a year to go to Eilat, once or twice to Ben Gurion Airport, and just continue what we know how to do best, is have fun.
Okay, Judith, what will you look forward to doing most?
Going to the States and visiting my 90-year-old mother.
I can sympathize with that view very much indeed. I haven't seen my mum for a long time either. Benjamin, what are you going to do? What's the one thing you're really looking forward to doing?
I'd like to, as I mentioned earlier on one of the shows, visit one of my favorite places in Israel, Ein Bokek, and go to Ein Bokek at the height of Israeli's oppressive heat wave, if there is one, or at least during that period of July, August, when it's 45 degrees in the desert, and spend time on the Dead Sea.
Well, that sounds idyllic for those that, well, as the movie says, some like it hot, don't they, Benjamin? That's the way. And Peter, what are you going to do? What's the thing that really turns you on looking ahead?
So I definitely miss having a hotel vacation, just being able to relax by the pool, not being worried about who's sitting next to me unless they're smoking a cigarette or something annoying like that. Not worrying about catching something I didn't have an intention to. And I think that is really, just put your mind at rest. And that is the silence that we, the peace of mind that we really miss in these times. It's this constant concern that you don't know who you're sitting with in the room and what you're going to get from them. So that for me would be the best outcome of some sense of normality again, and not less concern of contracting this virus or anything else.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, the one thing that I've missed more than anything, as I'm a real foodie, is being able to go to restaurants, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing the restaurants opening for the benefit of those that run those businesses and work in those businesses and supply them, and for the benefit of those of us in Israel who love going out to dine, because I think the range of Israeli restaurants and cuisine is just about the best in the world, and was one of the driving forces behind me wanting to be here in the first place, if I'm perfectly honest. So I'll be looking forward to hitting the streets and getting stuck into some great food in 2021. But that's just about all we've got time for. I want to thank my 4 guests, Rami Lador, Judith Sudilovsky, Benjamin Weinthal, and Peter Lerner. To thank you, of course, for taking the time to join us, and we look forward to you joining us again throughout 2021, when we'll be looking at the Israeli news and what the Israeli papers say. And of course, to wish you all a very happy new year, in the hope that 2021 proves to be a much, much better year than we've had to endure in 2020. So that's all for now. Happy New Year. Best wishes from Real Israel. Bye-bye for now.